everyone. My name is Celia Avila de Santiago, and I'm a senior librarian with the Los Angeles Public Library. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, LA Made Presents Alo Johnston, Talking All Things Gender. Before we begin, we'd like to thank the National Endowment for Humanities, our library foundation, and our behind-the-scenes staff for helping bring the LA Made programs to you virtually. LA Made focuses on the diverse landscape of Los Angeles, highlighting the immense artistic and performance talent that has developed in the course of the city's eclectic history. If you would like to see more of our amazing programs, please visit our online calendar at lapl.org/events. And for our LA Made programs, visit lapl.org/LAMade. Our website also has blog posts and video links that highlight the library's diverse resources and more of our upcoming programs. We would also like to take this opportunity to recognize and acknowledge the first people of this land, honor their elders, past and present, as well as their descendants who are citizens of these nations. For more information on which territory you may reside on, check out native-land.ca. And now for today's program with Alo Johnston. Therapist and author Alo Johnston is a licensed marriage and family therapist working in downtown Los Angeles. Alo draws from his personal as well as professional experiences on what happens after you come out and begin living as a trans person. With a lens on knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, he will be in conversation with moderator Vinzi Zalkind about all things gender. Am I Trans Enough is Johnston's first book and a guide to help readers find their authentic selves. Please email ecdept@lapl.org for an opportunity to win a copy of the book. And now, welcome to our virtual LA Made stage, Alo and Vinci.
Much, Celia. I am Vinci Zalkind with the Los Angeles Public Library, and I'm here with author Alo Johnston to talk about his book, Am I Trans Enough? And we will start today, I think, by you reading the introduction.
Sure, yeah. Happy to do so. All right. I spent years of my life asking myself if I was trans enough to transition and if I was trans enough to count. I learned the word genderqueer when I was in college, and it unlocked something enormous in me, but I had no idea what to do with that feeling. From 20 to 25 years old, I would watch every YouTube video I could find from trans and non-binary people talking about going on hormones and having surgery. I would lurk in countless message boards and online communities searching for answers. For a while, I convinced myself I was just fascinated by these people's stories, but eventually it became too hard to maintain a plausible deniability, and I knew I wanted someone to tell me if I should transition or not. I wanted to know if it would work out for me and if I would live. It felt life or death, and I know that was not an exaggeration. It was life or death. Everything hinged on whether I was able to figure this out. I looked for stories that were as close to mine as possible, searching for more and more similarities until I realized I was searching the internet for a video of myself in the future, speaking back to my younger and more confused self. I wanted someone to reach through my computer screen and say, "This is who you are and this is what you need to do." I never found one. Then, in an attempt to keep a balanced perspective and not get my hopes up, I would look up videos of people who had stopped hormones or detransitioned. It seemed to make sense. Maybe I was just pinning all of my hopes on this one thing and I wasn't actually trans. Maybe I just wanted to be trans because at least then I would have a path forward, even if it felt like a horrifying one. I would think about starting testosterone and I would list the few changes that felt exciting, and then I would list the much longer list of changes that felt unpleasant and overwhelming. I knew I wanted a deeper voice. Ironic. And more muscle mass, but I was terrified of growing body hair or losing the hair on my head. Looking at the men in my family did not soothe any of those anxieties, and the fears I had seemed to lurk in my genetic makeup, waiting to be unlocked by testosterone. I knew it was impossible to pick and choose which results I would get from hormones, so I would convince myself that there were far more cons than pros and try to put it aside again. This never actually felt like putting it aside, so much as trying to stuff the entire contents of my hopes, dreams, and fears into a tiny dark closet in the back of my brain, hoping the closet door would not explode open from overcrowding. The stretches of time where I felt okay became shorter and shorter, and the occurrence of what I started to call gender panic attacks got closer and closer together. The gender panic attacks were when that closet burst open unexpectedly because I had gently brushed past some minuscule gender trigger. The triggers got smaller and the panic got larger. Eventually, I could not stop thinking about hormones. I knew I'd reached the limits of where my imagination could take me, and I would have to try testosterone in order to find out how I would feel on it. I couldn't imagine what it would do to my body physically, and I couldn't imagine how it would make me feel mentally. Making that decision felt like jumping off a cliff. I was afraid of having to live life as a trans person, and I was afraid of finding out that transition wouldn't save me. I had been white-knuckling life, knowing that it was unsustainable unless something drastic had to change in order for me to make it to old age. I wasn't actively suicidal in the same ways I had heard people discuss suicide, but I had made detailed plans that always started with, if things don't get better by the time I'm 30, then I can't keep doing this. At that time, I lived in Los Angeles and sought out an informed consent clinic to start the process of getting on hormones. I knew I wouldn't be able to convince a doctor or therapist that I was trans because I didn't know if I was. I just knew I had to try. I did the blood test, I signed the packet of forms that notified me of what to expect and what sort of side effects might exist, and eventually I got my prescription. I received my supplies and testosterone in the mail in about a week. 5 minutes after my first testosterone injection was the first time in my entire life I truly thought, what if this works for me? What if this is actually what I need? And what if this does change my life for the better? Needless to say, nothing physically had happened to me after 5 minutes on testosterone. My voice hadn't gotten deeper, and I was far from seeing increased muscle mass. But I think there was something about the testosterone being in my body and it being unremovable that allowed me to stop focusing on all my fears and allowed me to focus on my hopes for the first time. As much as I thought I had been doing that consciously for the past 5 years, really I had been so terrified of being wrong that I had not truly known what optimism even felt like. I had not been balancing hope and fear, idealism and discretion. I had been feeding my fears and suffocating my hope. I had been so careful to balance the positive stories with the negative stories that I hadn't noticed that throughout my whole life, I had been fed negative stories about transition and that the whole scale was wildly unbalanced from the start. It turned out that my worst fears about physical changes were because of the limitations of my imagination. I could not imagine the fullness of my experience as an embodied and happy adult. The only way for me to know what it felt like was to experience it for myself. I imagine you have come to this book with many of your own questions of if you are trans enough and what you're supposed to do with your endless thoughts about gender. I imagine many of you are somewhere in the online lurking phase of questioning or at the stage where you're still half convinced that you are just incredibly fascinated with the concept of gender on a theoretical level. Perhaps you have been living with an increasing sense of unease in your life and have never been able to figure out what it is and have some inkling it might be about your body or your identity. Maybe you've already decided, yeah, maybe I'm non-binary or transgender, but I'm fine. I think I can just ignore that forever. And then you have the 12th panic attack this month about the neckline of your shirt. Maybe taking any steps towards social or medical transition seems too overwhelming and would break your parents' hearts, so you have decided to take this with you to your grave. Maybe sometimes you think, sure, I want some of those transition effects, but I'm not like those real trans people with real dysphoria, so I'm probably just appropriating the trans experience. Maybe you think your experience might actually just be internalized misogyny or a fetish. If any of those things sound familiar, then you have come to the right place. As much as you might like to look to an external source for verification and validation, there's no such thing. There's no saliva, urine, or blood test to tell you if you're positive for the trans. There's no MRI, EEG, or PET scan to detect it. It's actually a very good thing that there aren't those tests, but sometimes it can feel like a horrible and confusing burden. It can feel impossible to assess your own internal experience of gender when it's all subjective and therefore susceptible to all of your self-doubt and second-guessing. How can you be sure? How can you validate yourself? I can give you one small piece of information right now. If you've ever asked yourself, am I trans enough? The answer is undoubtedly yes. You are. I hope this is great news and a relief, but if it does not feel like great news, that's okay too. If your immediate response to that statement is resistance, that's also fine. It's okay for you to not feel trans enough yet or have no idea if you're trans at all. Stick with this for a while and see what comes up for you. Perhaps try reading this book while gently holding question, what if this was relevant to my experience? And simply staying open to what might come from it. You don't have to act on any of this. You're not required to take any steps or actions regardless of what you decide at the end. But know that even if you only decide you're trans in your own mind and never speak it out loud to anyone, your experience is just as welcome and valid as anyone else's. For better or worse, there's no ignoring your thoughts. If you try to ignore them, they'll pop up at the most inconvenient moments and only get louder and louder, which means whether this results in outward action or not, the only way out is through. The only way to not stay trapped in the loop of your brain is circling day in and day out is to stop and look directly at it. And it also may mean that things will get worse before they get better. But you are far stronger than you think, and I hope you have the continued courage to keep reading and find out what's within you. This book is not a workbook or a guide, and once you finish it, you'll not have a 5-year plan. This book is about the barriers that are most likely in the way of you reaching your most authentic self without you even knowing it, and how to begin to address them. It's split into 4 parts that address what's likely to be impeding your internal progress, some of the historical narratives that are contributing to those thoughts, how to address some of the mental health effects that may have stemmed from them, and how they might be affecting your interpersonal relationships. This book might be better described as a philosophical self-help book. As a therapist and a trans person, I believe there's a great amount of power in being able to reclaim our own experiences back from a cisgender perspective. So this book is from a trans perspective for the trans and questioning communities. It's born out of thousands of hours of discussions with hundreds of trans people. It's a collection of what works and a rejection of what feels like it should work but does not. As I have worked with my trans and questioning clients, I have found that there are reappearing barriers and mental blocks that consistently keep people stuck in mental loops. And there are very few people discussing these ideas publicly. Many resources seek to educate and soothe the fears of cis people, and there are a few that are directed to trans people and their concerns. As much as I think there's a need for resources for allies, I think the kinds of messages that are necessary to reassure cisgender people do a disservice to trans and questioning people. When we focus on an outside cisgender audience, then we can censor the kind of stories that are most useful for trans people to hear. Attempting to create that clean narrative around gender and transition for cis people erases the more complicated and nuanced experiences that need to be told. Parts of this book will be controversial and there's a lot of space for debate, but I hope it creates much needed space for trans people to engage with their fears and doubts without the pressure of appearing to be a perfect trans representative. Primarily, I wrote this book to serve and benefit the trans community above all else. I have written to help you see that you're not alone and you're not the first person to have these questions and these doubts. There are many people who have walked this path before you and they were just as scared and unsure. While there's no map, I can hope I can save you the time of walking in circles.
Thank you so much. I think that's the second or third time I've heard you read the intro, and it's very comforting and soothing. So thank you.
Thank you.
So before we get into some of the nitty gritty of the book, I wanted to ask a little bit about your writing process, as this is your first book.
Yeah.
What was surprising to you about the world of publishing and bringing all of your thoughts into a long form piece of writing?
Yeah. I don't know if this is an annoying answer, especially for the people who have asked me advice on writing a book and getting it published. I don't know if this is what people expect me to say, but I definitely did not know I was writing a book when I started writing this. I started writing during the pandemic in around November of 2020, which was a deeply scary but also boring time. There wasn't a lot to do. And I think a lot of people were starting to realize that they had questions about their gender, they had questions about their sexuality. So I was just getting tons of emails from potential clients, and unfortunately was having to turn away a lot of people, which was really hard for me. But I started realizing I was having the same conversations over and over again, and I wanted, it just felt like time to write it down. But I thought I was writing an article. And then it became a really long article. And I was like, maybe this is an article series. And then I just kept typing and typing and typing until a friend eventually was just like, you're writing a book, just admit you're writing a book. So I think that was good and bad. It was good because I didn't freak myself out. And I think if I had in my mind I'm writing a book, it would have created some pressure. But that meant I wrote really quickly, and then I had the horrible process of editing it because I didn't, I was just like, here's a thought, here's a second thought, here's another thought with no sense of cohesive. Someone has to sit down and read this in any sort of order. So that was a little difficult. But it was interesting in the process of trying to get published because sort of all of the advice that I had heard, I don't think it's wrong, but I think a lot of it is about fiction. A lot of it is sort of a different audience, and I think a lot of the agents that I tried to find representation from seemed to think that the book was very niche, and I think it is somewhat niche for sure. This book is not going to be sold in an airport bookstore. I don't think it's for everyone.
You don't think you'll be next to John Grisham?
Sadly, I will not be probably in the New York Times bestseller list by any means, but I think there is a misconception that this is incredibly niche. And I think in my experience and just talking to so many people that it's not as niche as people think it is. I think there's a lot more, there's just this perception of trans people are 1% of the population. There's an idea of how they figure this out and what kind of information is needed and there isn't much of an audience for it. So I think I found that a little frustrating. And I sort of had to forego some of the traditional routes. I had to sort of go directly to publishers and just be I had written the whole book at that point, so why not? And I think my experience of now that it's out and getting a lot of feedback from it is just like, this is such a needed conversation that like really doesn't occur other places. And that's frustrating when like, obviously some of publishing is marketing and money and business. And, you know, there's the perspective from the author, which is just like, I just want people to hear this. I never was writing this to like get rich or famous. That was not my intention or my goal. I'm sure there's much easier ways to do that. But I just wanted people to be able to hear it. So I think that has been nice that it's now at that place. And, you know, there were places along the way that I was just like, come on, like, give me a chance.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that it's out. You are coming up on, it's been out for close to a year, right?
Not quite, like 6 months?
6 months?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, half a year, close to a year.
Depending on how you round, yes.
So I have a lot of quotes from your book that I wrote down, and I will preface that I think that there is so many wonderful little nuggets in this book that are fun. Also, you just have a very wonderful writing style. But there is a part in chapter 3, and I just want to start with it because it is one of my favorite lines in this book.
Yeah.
That is, it is safe to say that most trans people initially question their gender the same way they would enter a haunted house. There better not be anything that is going to jump out at me from the shadows or I will scream. And I just love that. I think that's such an easy way to phrase that. So the current landscape is a little bleak, but you have a quote in the book that's been sticking with me. Our goal is not to eradicate transness, but to eradicate the distress of the experience. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is true of a lot of like othering that exists. It's just like, how do we make these people like normal people? And you hear that a lot when like people don't want to be called cisgender. They're like, I'm not cisgender, I'm normal. And you're like, okay, that's not how this works. But like, if you have normal and then the other, then there's sort of this desire to like collapse everyone into normal or make everyone normal or like make sure you eradicate queerness or transness or whatever. And there are a lot of people who are attempting to do that. And obviously, you know, like certain kinds of conversion therapy are an attempt to just be like, how do we make you straight and cisgender? And I don't think being trans is not hard inherently. Living in a transphobic society is what makes it hard. Like, if you see being transgender as just like a natural human possibility, that, you know, some people have red hair and some people have brown hair and some people are transgender, like, it doesn't have to have this morality attached. It doesn't have to have all of these things. But, you know, I think in the same way that like sometimes you hear a child coming out and their parents are like, no, you're not, because I don't want you to get bullied, which is just like, you're sort of acknowledging that the problem is other people, and you're sort of acknowledging that like, I'm not going to protect you from that. I maybe even am going to contribute to that. I am going to be a bully to you. So I think, you know, the world is what makes this hard, and the world is, you know, again, I think there's, of course, so much parallels to the queer experience too, where coming out is hard because people assume you're straight. Coming out is hard because people assume that you're cisgender. Coming out doesn't even really need to be something that exists if we didn't make assumptions, but we do. We live in a society of assumptions.
Sure. That's, yeah. So I know that you can, my next question for you, I know you can talk a lot about, but do you want to, would you give us just a little bit of a look at the way that the DSM operates with regards to the trans and gender questioning youth, and what was your experience like as a trans person getting your LMFT?
I mean, I think anyone who has had any experience with the DSM knows that it's very much about pathology. It's just like, there's a normal way to be a person and there's an abnormal way to be a person. And this is the Bible of abnormal ways to be a person. And I think when you look at the history of the DSM, obviously it has changed for lots of reasons. The first 2 editions of the DSM were like really descriptive. They were not sort of like diagnostic criteria that's like this, and this equals this. It was a much more descriptive thing. And then, you know, the sort of medical model, insurance, all of these things combined to make a disastrous system, according to me, that is just, again, an attempt at pathology. And I think there's a lot that's complicated about being transgender, is that right now, based on how insurance works, you need to have a diagnosis of some kind in order for people to get care, because care is, especially in the United States, extremely expensive. So I think that people are like, do we categorize it as a physical disease in the sort of disease model? Do we categorize it as a mental disease in this disease model? Neither is great. They're both diseases. They're both pathology. And I do think there is, and I talk about it a little bit, like there are some alternatives. If you categorize it as sort of a medical condition, which, in the ICD, I don't even know what number we're on, I think 11, which is the sort of categorizing of physical conditions, not mental conditions, that you notice that there's like pregnancy in the ICD-11, which is not a disease, it's just a physical condition, but it also allows you to access, insurance care and things like that. So I think it's really complicated because, of course, I think to remove stigma, you have to remove it from the book of stigma. This is sort of inherently, the DSM is a book of stigma. And also, we don't really have an alternative system of how people can access affordable, especially things like surgeries. So, I think we exist in a space where being trans is pathology as much as people sort of talk around it or like, oh, not really. Like, again, it's in the book of pathology. Right. So I think personally, like I had a lot of parallel experiences of discovering that I wanted to be a therapist and discovering that I was transgender. And I, felt like, much like many therapists that, I think you're drastically out of frame. It's all good.
It's following you.
Okay.
It's sentient, apparently.
It's all good. It's all good. That, I had a desire to help people, which I think is like many people's stories, and particularly many therapist stories. But that can mean so many things, and I didn't really know what that looked like in terms of, like, how do I want to do that? So I think my experience going through college was figuring out a lot of my gender, and, realizing that first, I think I'm transgender. Second, I really like talking about gender, and gender is a thing that I can sort of talk about endlessly, as will be probably very apparent in this discussion and while I answer questions that I just ramble. But I think that, like, it's an interesting thing. I think true, like you go to grad school to become a therapist and everyone's there because they first wanted to figure themselves out and then they wanted to help other people. That's pretty much most therapists. So that experience of figuring out my own identity and wanting to, again, like I said in the intro, like I don't necessarily think I have a level of expertise that's impossible for someone else to have, but I think I can save people time. I think I have like a lot of context. I have talked to tons of people. I have thought about this personally for a very long time, and I have my own life experience, but I also have just talked to so many trans people that I think, in my own experience, I spent years sort of questioning and going around and around the circles and being like, maybe not for years and years on end. That I think the experience as a therapist sometimes where someone comes in, they have the expectation that this is going to take a really long time. And then, a month later, they're like, oh, I think I want to go on hormones. And I'm like, some people truly just need the permission.
Sure.
But some people just need to hear from like an alternate source where, again, I think our society is so transphobic in just a general sense that means that hearing someone who is not hearing an alternative is like sometimes the first time being able to talk to me can sometimes be the first time that they got an alternative where it's just like, maybe see how that goes.
Sure. I love that there is such a chasm between it either being like, it can be like a month, or what you said, like you had in your introduction, that it was just finding like a gender affirming, like I apologize, that's not the right word I was looking for, but finding the like informed consent care. And it just, Oh, I'm sorry. We are having camera difficulties,
It's just all me.
which is totally just something. So there is, on page 121, you talk about paying attention to when your inner child starts to come out and act up. You say to tell them that they are doing great and you love them very much. Be the adult that the child needed and still needs. And you mentioned some nice little affirming actions, which I know we were talking about right before this. I had just the physical actions of touch and verbal speech allow you to escape the old mental scripts. So you mentioned try holding your arms or putting your hand to your chest as you say it, and if you feel comfortable doing so, speak to that child part view out loud. Do you want to demonstrate that with me real quick?
Sure. Can you just give a little context first, and then we can definitely.
Of course.
I just want to say, I know that like the inner child phrasing for some people is, I know I have a reaction to it. It just got sort of, pop psychology, or you imagine sort of the like very new age type of therapist. That's not everyone's favorite. And I understand like there are certain things that can come up with that. And I think what I talk about a lot is that like inner child is basically just like that younger version of you that exists and maybe didn't get what you needed. And I think probably every trans person didn't get what they needed to some extent. There's just like that younger version of us that's like not affirmed in some way. And it doesn't have to be like you had explicitly transphobic people who were saying explicitly transphobic things, but I have a memory of watching movies where the joke was that there's a man in a dress, or hearing people make like RuPaul jokes before I had any idea who RuPaul was.
I know that I talked with some friends the other day, but I don't know if I can rewatch the first Ace Ventura.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Ace Ventura.
Yes, does not.
It was
up, unfortunately.
very common in like the 90s and early 2000s. It's still plenty common. It's not as common, thankfully, on like television. But I think like just being around people who laugh at those jokes, or hearing people sort of casually find that kind of stuff funny. It doesn't even have to be someone saying something transphobic. You're just like, oh. And my experience, like watching Ace Ventura, my experience hearing people make those jokes about RuPaul, that I was like, I don't really understand what's going on. But I knew I was unsafe. And I knew that I had to hide something. And I had no idea I was trans. I had no idea that this was about gender. I was just like, oh, I need to hide. So I think like when I talk about the inner child stuff, like it's like there's that, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, however old part of you who just needs like that validation that you never got. And so that practice that you're talking about is sort of being able to like give that validation. And that was too much context, but
I appreciate the context, and I'm sure our viewers at home do as well. So yes, can we try that? Putting your hand on your chest and as you say it, and speaking to that child part out loud. Is there?
Yeah.
It feels like I know it's a little hard to state that, but
yeah, I mean, I think again, like I sort of talk about like being able to speak out loud slows your brain down and like does something very different. Our brain goes really, really fast, and we go into all those old things. So I think being able to like hold your arms or like put your hand on your chest, trying to not cover this this microphone, and just say like, hey, I know you're scared. Hey, I know this is a situation where you were not validated, and also I'm here for you. Like, be able to be the adult that you need and the child who needs it. And say what that child needs, which is just like, you're safe, you're okay, I'm here for you. Like, I'm never gonna abandon you. Like whatever that little kid needed to hear. And again, I think it can feel silly sometimes, but like push through the silly, push through the feeling of silly. Just say it and be alone if you need to be. Go in your car if you need to go in your car. Do whatever you need to do. But like, and truly like be able to like give yourself the hug that you need in that moment.
It is a nice little warm hug. So as we're talking about all of these different things, especially when you talk about like the DSM, which is very much, I feel like I'm committing a lot of jargon when we talk about that.
Yeah.
You do have a quote, though, that I will share a small secret of the trade. It's probably a big mess of complicated stuff. This is the official terminology. Is there any other trade secrets or official terminology you want to share with us?
I love that official terminology that I created myself. No, I think, and in the like context of that, like I've heard so many of my clients who will go to, again, well-meaning therapists who are allies, but like maybe not as well trained in this, and that person will be like, "Oh, I hear that you have some questions about gender, but like let's deal with the trauma first, or let's deal with the depression first." And my big mess of stuff official terminology is that like you can't pull those apart. There's no way to just be like, let's work on depression and then we'll get to your gender stuff. If you do that, people get really, really stuck. And I've heard people who've spent a lot of time in therapy who've gotten really, really stuck because their therapist just wants to deal with it separately. And you can't deal with it separately. Like I said, there's sort of the trauma, and I talk about this a lot in the book, the trauma of existing as a trans person in a transphobic society. Again, no one has to explicitly you don't have to be mugged. You don't have to have someone scream a slur at you in order for you to have that experience of like, oh, it's not safe for me to be who I am. So like the trauma's connected, the depression's connected, the anxiety's connected. All of those things are a big mess of here's the gender stuff and like trying to be like, let's pull out this thread. You're like pulling all of it. It's just a big knot. And I think being able to find someone who can respect that piece is my official terminology in that respect. The big mess of stuff.
Big mess of stuff. Just a big ball of it, like a rubber band ball.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I said it earlier, but I'm quoting your book so much, but there really is just so much that really stuck out to me while I was like reading through it and getting ready for the day.
Yeah.
You are a trans person and an educator, but not all trans people are inherently trans educators.
Yeah.
Another quote, you say, even with the people you love and care about most, you may not be able to answer every question, but there is no resource online or in print that is going to give your loved ones answers about you specifically. How would you encourage trans people to relieve that frustration?
Yeah, I think what I talk about a lot is like the all or nothing feeling of I either have to educate everyone all the time or just be like, Google it, which I think is totally an understandable response sometimes. But the reality is there are things that when someone's like, oh, I don't know how to use they, them pronouns, you can be like, there are books, there are guides, there are YouTube videos, like these are things that you can find elsewhere. I do not need to be the person to teach you. And when someone's asking you, people that you want in your life, people, your partners, your family, your friends, the people you actually appreciate around you who are asking about your personal experience, if you're like, Google it, and they're like, that's not a thing I can Google. Like, I want to understand you. I want to know who you are so I can support you. I want to know like who I am relating to. That I think just being able to first acknowledge that like we all have to be in the middle ground, and sometimes you're going to be closer to the educator side and you're like, I'm feeling really generous today, or I feel like I have a lot of energy today. Other times you're going to be like, I have no capacity and I really just need to be like, I can't answer that for you and I need you to do some of that research on your own, or that's not a thing that you can research, but like I cannot answer it today and I would love to have a conversation with you eventually, but it can't be today. And I think being able to acknowledge that you will always be on this moving spectrum and don't decide if you're going to be educator 100% of the time for the rest of your life, and don't decide that you're like, I'm never going to answer a question ever for anyone at any point. So I think, yeah, like first in those moments, check in with your capacity, check in with what space you have, and notice, again, are these people that you feel obligated to answer? Are these people that you truly want in your inner circle? You want to understand you? You make different decisions around, again, this is like a coworker I met 10 minutes ago who's asking about my genitals. Always inappropriate that you're like, don't need to answer that one. There's no desire to be an educator that would make that an appropriate thing for me to answer. And again, like the people that you want to get it. So allow yourself to be in that gray area. Allow it to be a moving space. and check in with like, is this a question that resources exist? Is this a question about general trans things? Is this a question about something scientific, something about the history of they them pronouns? Like, you don't have to be the person who rehashes what is a really well written article that exists on the internet, or is a really well written book that exists in the space that you're like, hey, here's a resource.
Really well written.
Exactly. So I think just checking in with the like, why is this person asking this question? What it would be the purpose of me answering, and is this something that they could access elsewhere?
Sure. And I know that nobody's journey is going to be the exact same as someone else's journey, but I do feel like it is such a badge that you get for being queer Google at some point in your journey. That just happens.
Yeah, and we all feel obligated at some point. And I know even in grad school, like I went to a grad school that had an LGBT specialization, and I was like, oh, well, they understand. And still there were moments that I was like, oh, I'm being placed in the role of educator, or sometimes I was placing myself in the role of educator, and pulling that apart is important too, of just being like, did someone ask, or did I decide that this was my job, my unpaid internship, which is sort of the experience of being the unpaid intern of the trans experience, where you're like, okay. So, I think any setting has the possibility for that, and we all have to protect our energy and, not push everyone out all the time and just be like, well, I don't want to share anything with anyone, because, you gotta, hopefully the whole point is so that you relate with people better and you feel like you can be your authentic self with other people.
Thank you for such an eloquent little tag there. So as I was getting prepared for this panel, I was hanging around. There's a Discord server I'm in that's all like cool trans people that play pinball.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Love it. And it made me think about another quote. The difficulties of being trans don't stem from internal experience of gender, but from a society that doesn't allow trans lives to be joyful. We must find our communities that accept and celebrate the joy. So how have you found community, and what advice do you have for those still searching?
Yeah, I mean, I think have in real life trans friends if at all possible. And I know that's not possible for everyone, but if it is at all possible, take the effort. And I think I encourage this to the point where sometimes people are like, you don't think like online friends are real? And I absolutely think online friends are real and so important. And often like I think people's first access to a trans community. So like find a trans community in whatever way you can. And if that's online, and if it can only be online, that's great. Like so much better than being isolated. And if you can find people in your like physical community who can support you, because I think that's a huge thing. And I think, again, like I said, like there can be a lot of trauma in the experience. And I think you can notice that sometimes there are a lot of traumatized trans people, like obviously no fault of their own. Like it's a hard thing to grow up as a trans person. It's a hard thing to come out. It's a hard thing to do every single step of this. And I will say, I think it's worth it. Doesn't mean it's not hard. And I think sometimes that can turn into people seeking out experiences that upset them. And you might notice you go on Twitter where people are like, it seems like it's your full-time job to like get in Twitter fights. And, I understand the desire. I've certainly been a person who has gotten into like too many internet fights. And I think I thankfully have mostly stopped doing that. But I think you have to, remove yourself from, if you're looking for bigots, if you're looking for people who hate you, you will find them. They're certainly out there. There's no difficulty finding that, which is all the more reason that you need to find people who love you, support you, like think you're great, think you're wonderful, are excited to see you. And I think that can be anything. Like, I think having a space, whether it is pinball or anything else that is like great, have people who are like in your life and you get to enjoy stuff with, and do it in whatever way is like inherently fun for you. I think there have also been spaces where I'm just like, oh, it's a bunch of trans people, like I should get along with them. And then been like, I don't have anything in common with these people except our gender experience. And that's okay. Like I don't have to be friends with every trans person. Of course, there are going to be trans people. We have very different interests and we are very different kinds of people. I still like appreciate community, of course. And I think also, like, yeah, you don't need to force yourself to like enjoy certain things. Like if you are a trans person who, loves pinball, find your trans pinball space. If you're a trans person who loves video games, find your like trans video game space. If you're a trans person who loves like playing soccer, find that space. And if it doesn't exist, like see if you can create it, because I think there's probably other people who want it if it's not out there.
Hey, thank you. So I think we've got some audience questions that had been, I know we had been soliciting some questions beforehand. We've got some of them written down.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
Sure.
I know you picked aside a couple questions you really liked.
Some of the questions were similar. So I lumped two questions together for the first one, and you can also let me know if you also think they're similar. But one question was, what are some unique perspectives or insights that you offer in your book that may not be commonly discussed in other resources regarding trans or LGBTQI issues in general? And then the second question that I thought was pretty similar, or I will answer as if they are, what are some misconceptions or stereotypes about being trans enough that you addressed in your book? I really love the first third of the book, and it's sort of why I wrote it, and what in the introduction I called the philosophical self-help book is this like isn't a guidebook. It isn't sort of a like, I think there are a lot of books that ask you a question, you can write your answer, and I think that can be extremely helpful for some people. But like the kinds of questions that I had in that time where I was like watching every YouTube video ever were frequently not addressed in like the vlogs, were frequently not addressed when people are talking about like, oh, I'm, 6 months on hormones and here's what's happened. There was just a lot of doubts. So I almost feel like I went through the chapter titles of the first third of my book, and there are many of those things. But some of the stuff that I talk about, and I think that like this is maybe the most foundational theme of the whole book, is that the only way to know for sure is by doing. You can't think really hard and you can't speculate really hard and know for sure that you're trans or know for sure that transition is going to be right for you. And I think that was one of the biggest and scariest realizations in my own life was I have to try things in order to know if they're right for me. And it goes really counter to what we are taught, which is just be like, make sure you're 110% sure before, you go on hormones, or make sure you're 110% sure before you, decide to have top surgery or whatever it may be. It's not possible to be 110% sure until you start presenting, you start going through the motions, you start trying on, you start doing the is this better, is this worse? Not in a theoretical way, because my imagination was incredibly wrong about a whole lot of things, including what I thought I would like about hormones. Like, I was terrified of having body hair, as I think I wrote in the intro. Turns out that's not actually a thing that I hate, but it was something that was very, very hard for me to imagine based on, I sort of imagined the body I had pre-testosterone and just like slapped a bunch of body hair on it. And I was like, I don't want that. And that is not how it went. That I think as small things changed, the other things made sense along with them. So that's one big piece of what I talk about. I talk about how inaction or waiting is not a neutral experience. It's often a thing we often tell to like teenagers who are trans or gender questioning, is that just wait and it'll be fine. And I think that can be actually a really harmful thing to tell people. I talk about how transitioning for other people, I think a lot of times people feel like they should only be doing it for themselves. And I think you got to do it for you, but you got to do it for your relational experience as well, because we are social creatures. One of my favorite chapter titles is "Your Gender Doesn't Care What You Think of It," and that is confusing, I think, to people just as a sentence. If it's controversial to you, I say read it. But basically, like, my feeling is we can support our gender, or we can sort of make our gender's job more difficult, very much. And I have the metaphor of like, you can support your liver or you can make your liver's job more difficult. Whether or not you know your liver exists or what it does, like you can still support it or you can make its life hard. That I think in some ways our gender is similar. Like our gender exists and we can support it or we can make it harder for it. And that can sometimes, like I don't think that's like your gender holding you hostage, but I do think that means that like you can't force your gender to be something that it isn't. You can't just be like, oh, I really, 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 really want to be a girl and I'm going to force it. Like the things that work for it. And I think I also talk about like sometimes labels aren't the most helpful thing to start with. Sometimes it's just like, like clothes or words or names or pronouns, like
Sure.
maybe the things that you're just like, does this feel good? Does this feel better? Does this feel worse? I could keep going, but those are a few of the things that I feel maybe aren't mentioned in some of the other resources or some of the like, I don't know, misconceptions or stereotypes, as this person put it, that are just like, what does it mean to be trans enough? Another question, well, two other questions that I also combined together. One person asked, is it normal for a trans man to not want to try living as a butch woman first before going on T? And someone asked, what is the difference between a stone butch woman and a trans man? They're different questions, but similar enough that
They both have very specific terminology.
For sure. I think if you understand gender, and I think a lot of people do, sort of understand like you become so butch or you become so masculine that you must transition. You are like too masculine to be butch and now you have to be a man, which I'm like, isn't you have so much that you are forced over. I think, of course, it is very possible to be a feminine trans man. It is very possible to be a masculine trans woman. It is very possible to be gay. While you're trans, like you don't have to be straight. You don't have to be sort of masculine presenting man. You don't have to be a feminine presenting woman. So I think when we have this conception of like you become so butch that you transition, that can get really confusing for people because that is not what it is. And I think personally, like I have friends who I think have a really, really similar conception of their gender identities and they don't identify as men. I'm just like, we have the same vibe. We got the same thing going on. And like some of those people are trans, some of them, identify as non-binary, some of them, who's to say? Like some people have had sort of medical transition, whether that's hormones or surgery, some have not. And I'm just like, yeah, I think our gender's like similar. So I think like the answer to what is the difference between a stone butch woman and a trans man is like everything and nothing. Like the question is complicated in that, I think it is very possible for those two people, if you have those two people, to have really, really similar internal experiences. And it's very possible for those two people to have very, very drastically different internal experiences. And being trans is not just being like, oh, I have like overloaded masculinity for womanhood, so I must step into this other category. For me, I think I focused so much on labels that I got really, really stuck because I was like, well, I have some feminine interests, I have some masculine interests. People kept being like, well, like women can do anything, like you can be a masculine woman.
Well, I was going to say, I'm going to bring up a very 2000s term that I think that what you're talking about too speaks so much to the vast spectrum of things that it feels like over time as well, there have been flash in the pan terms to describe queerness or queerness that does not exist within queerness, that like, what was that term from 2005? Like metrosexual, that was like, well, this person grooms themselves well, but they're not gay.
You're a well-groomed straight man, so we have to give you a new term. Which,
right.
Yeah, I think there are these sort of, like you have broken out of what is the societal bounds of like, this is what we consider a woman, this is what we consider a man. And for me, that meant I had a lot of like, do I have internalized misogyny? I just don't want to be like a masculine woman. And that wasn't the answer for me. Like when I put down the labels for a while and was just like, Does it feel better for me to use a different name? Does it feel better for me to have a different haircut? Does it feel better for me to wear different clothes? And eventually getting like, does it feel better for me to be on hormones? Which, again, I had many cycles of being terrified of trying. But eventually getting to that space and being like, let me just put down the labels for a while and follow and explore what my body needs, what my brain needs, like what my mental health needs, and then figure out the label later. And I talk about that a lot too, which is just like follow that, put down the labels for a while and follow that. And you might find that the label comes really easily once you get comfortable in these other senses, where for me, I was like, oh, okay, my hair feels right. My clothes feel right. My body is beginning to feel right, because for me, hormones were something that I needed, that like, having top surgery felt right. That then it became very clear that I was like, oh, man feels fine. And it didn't have to be a big thing. And in fact, it was like actually pretty, I always feel like it would be like if there was a movie about my life, it would be just this very uncinematic moment where I was just like, that sounds right. Like it was this huge existential question. And then I put it down and I followed the things that worked for me. And then it was just like, all right, that sounds right. It didn't have to be this dramatic moment. So I think, the answer is that I cannot tell you what a butch woman is, and I cannot tell you what a trans man is. And you have to sort of decide like what feels good for me, and then figure out like what label feels good for me.
I think we've got time for maybe like one or two more. Can I cut in with one of the ones that I think is a very important question? Not to make you a trans educator, but in your opinion, what are some important steps society can take to create a more inclusive and accepting environment for transgender and LGBTQIA individuals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always small things, and I would recommend like any ally sort of looks into, and there were a lot of questions, unfortunately, I don't know if we'll have the chance to get to, but there were a lot of questions about sort of like, how do you support someone in the workplace, or like, how can an employer support someone coming out and things like that. I think, yes, absolutely look into the resources that exist for that in terms of, like putting your pronouns in your email signature. Like there are small things that, of course, is very easy to do. And I think the sort of biggest general, most umbrella advice I can give is like, don't have expectations. I think that is the solution. Like I said, when, people have a strong reaction to their kids coming out, it's because they expected that their child was going to be a certain way. And a lot of times we don't realize the expectations we have until they're, not met. But I think doing everything that you can to not have an expectation of who your child's going to be, who your partner is going to be, who your friends are going to be across time, because the person that you met might not be the person who, continues to sort of show up as they grow more comfortable, or just like, of course, like there's a fluidity in life. And, of course, some people just identify as gender fluid. There can be a fluidity across, today I feel one way and tomorrow I feel a different way, and that's fine. And I think feeling comfortable with fluidity, not feeling like someone has to stay exactly the way that they started out for you to be able to engage with them. Don't have an expectation of like, this is who my child's going to grow up to be, or, I expect my partner is going to remain the same for the rest of their lives. Which first, I think even being able to see it as like a benefit, people growing is cool and exciting, and knowing everything about someone in the first like year that you met them, it's cool to like get to learn more about someone. And I think being able to see that as an opportunity, like being able to feel excited that someone's sharing these things and you get to know someone better and you get to see more of their journey, like allow that to be an opportunity rather than like a hassle. I think that would do so much for the world.
I think if you've got one last one that you have kind of a quick answer, we can get to that before we wrap up.
Yeah. I sort of was interested in this question because obviously I have no idea who wrote it, but I will just read. It said, I heard trans men have the same amount of white matter in their brains as cishet men. Would getting a brain scan in advance help eliminate some of the doubt that one has about medically transitioning? I will say upfront, I am not a doctor. I am not a neurosurgeon. I am not a neurologist. I am not anyone who has done brain scans. And from what I understand, the main difference between gender or sex, more specifically brains, is their size. There hasn't been like proven that there's any difference that I think a lot of old science really held on to, like men's brains are like this and women's brains are like this. That's been disproven a lot over time. And really the only distinction from what I understand in our current understanding of science is like there is a slight weight difference of like men's brains tend to weigh this much, where women's brains tend to weigh about this much. And it seems like trans people tend to map pretty well onto that in terms of, as this person said, potentially some of that is like the amount of white matter is that like trans men tend to align with cisgender men and trans women tend to align with cisgender women. I will say though, I don't think getting a brain scan will answer any of your questions. And I don't think it's so clear cut as like there's no overlap. I think, as I said in the intro, there's a desire to have a blood test. There's a desire to have a brain scan. There's a desire to have some sort of like EEG that is just like, you are trans. And I totally understand how there's a desire for an objective truth. And my belief around gender is that it is sort of part of our biology, part of how we grow up in our society, part of just like our own sort of subjective experience of those things, that you can't just be like, well, my bones say this, my blood says this, my brain matter says this. So I, again, don't know who asked that question. I suspect there might be just a desire to like, I really want to know that I'm definitely trans and I want to assure myself that I'm not wrong about being trans. And I get it. And also, I don't think it can be answered in that way. And I hope, you're able to engage with, I think if you still have some of those questions, many of those doubts are probably addressed in the book.
I think you stressed a lot too within your intro and on a lot of your questions and answers that you gave, that a lot of it too is just on personal reflection. And that I think that's like the one thing I can really take away is that no matter what tests I want to take or someone wants to take, it comes down to what you feel and what you know is your truth, which is a tough thing, I think, to face. But
yeah, and I think for me, that sort of my journey started with the like, why me? Like the existential, why is this happening to me? And I think that's a lot of people's experiences. And when I was able to be like, what if it just is? What if it's not good or bad? What if it is? What if I don't know why? It just is. What if I never have answers about how I got this way? It just is. What if I just accept that it is? That opened up so much more space for me to be able to be like, okay, what do I do with that? Instead of, let me fight the universe. Let me shake my fist at the sky. Let me like argue against the shoulds of how I should have been born or how I should have grown up. And instead, I'm just like, this is what it is. And that felt so much freer.
Well, thank you so much for being here and for taking the time today to answer questions and talk about your book. It's about all the time we have. So thank you so much for joining us for today's LA Made program. If you'd like to see more of our amazing programs, go to lapl.org/events. Don't forget to email ecdepartment@lapl.org for an opportunity to win a signed copy of Ala's book. And please join us in person at the Central Library in downtown LA on September 29th from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. for the Los Angeles Libros Festival, a free bilingual book festival for the whole family. Los Angeles Libros Festival will offer entertainment for all ages, featuring Spanish language and bilingual storytelling, performances, workshops, and award-winning authors. For additional information, please visit lapl.org/librosfest. Until next time, we truly appreciate all your support. The success of LA Made and all of our library programs could not happen without viewers like you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.